those of you who are coming in or have come in, let's get going here. This is our last presentation of the day, and Jason Paquin from Chesapeake Systems is going to talk about the evolution of integration supporting a championship team and their growth in media. So here's a nice case study to end the day on, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions when we're done, and after this we'll have our panel. Thank you. Come on up, Jason.
All right.
Great to have you here.
Thank you. All right. Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rick, for having me here and everyone else on the committee. My name is Jason Paquin. I'm our CEO at Chesapeake Systems, and we've had the pleasure of working with the Philadelphia Eagles as their workflow solutions provider and kind of media tech architects for 4.5 years now. What I want to talk to you about today is more focused on our approach to the integrations and what they were trying to accomplish at the Eagles and how we approached what we learned from them and their goals and how we were able to make that successful and meet their needs through the last 4 years and how that was stressed by different areas of the system and what we needed to do to work with them effectively. What I will not be doing is going through every integration and detailing every aspect of every workflow, but we are going to touch on a lot of the tech in the workflow. So before I start, how many Eagles fans? I know we have a couple. All right. And how many Patriots fans? No Patriots fans? Perfect. Yeah. So for those of you who aren't Eagles fans, do you at least not like the Patriots? Is that because that's the usual story we hear. So what I want to talk about is all of the conglomerate of integrations that we've done for the Eagles and what that looks like. And I want to be very honest right up front. Instead of walking through this whole thing, I'll just tell you right up front, this is a fake slide. This is not the integrations of the Eagles. These are the right products. These are the errors that dictate what is actually going on, but this is not how we integrate it because it would be a disaster. We have done integrations like this a long time ago before we had an integration platform. What we want to talk about is how we came to a decision of a platform in the middle of all of these workflows and how that enhanced everything we were doing for the Eagles. So you'll see here, if we kind of walk through very quickly what we call traditional integration looks like. We have multiple centers of all of these workflows. There's the production SAN itself is a center of workflows, and it's kind of the file system being an orchestrator, and that does not bode well for the future when you go that route. We also have the workstation itself and the user as a central point of multiple workflows. We have a file server as a central point, and multiple other products in there. And so there's nothing that really is responsible for that core integration between all of the products in this kind of situation. And the success of this looks a lot like the end result of the Patriots in Super Bowl 52. They fail. So you get about to the halfway mark of the lifespan of all of this technology, and you realize that it wasn't a good approach. And then you find a way to revive it, and you make some changes to it, and then ultimately, in the end, you fail. A couple other points on this. It's really difficult to support this system because the documentation is really difficult. There's no standard that you're working with. In addition to that, one system failure, to kind of jump through this very quickly, can affect multiple parts of this workflow without you being able to track those very easily. So what we actually did is we did a services-driven integration. We put a product called Reach Engine in the middle. It's an integration platform. It's very similar in that piece of what we were working with that Uyala spoke about this morning or earlier today. It's the idea of putting a platform, a middleware platform, an integration platform, in the middle of all of the workflows so that it is a core that you can rely on, you can standardize around, and you can make a plan around for all of your future workflows. So I like to think of this a lot as almost like a galaxy or a galaxy where we've got something in the center that is that core, everything's orbiting around it. And at times, something's going to shoot off from that orbit and it's going to disappear. But other times, something's going to come in, it's going to catch orbit, and it's going to start rotating around. Products come and go, and they come and go constantly. And we need to be able to very quickly accommodate those as they come in and out of play for us. So with this core system in place, we have one central orchestrator. The edge systems can be changed out as needed. The time to implement new integrations here becomes much quicker because we have standards and we have a way that we're moving forward. The end-user training is very streamlined. You'll see some screenshots in a little bit here about what it looks like to be an end user in the system. And it's very simple UI that has a lot of workflow behind it, but it's all very hidden from them. So for an end user, it's a matter of training a new button or a new checkbox in a workflow UI and not a new place to go and run a workflow. Additionally, the support, and that's where we focus a lot on, is the support is very streamlined. We can do common documentation, common integration languages, and so a team of 13 to 15 engineers who weren't all involved in the install, who are supporting a client who is not very technically driven, who just wants to get their content done in a high, stressful environment during a game, is able to support them effectively because they're standards. So the first step was creating an integration plan. So we met with them in early 2014. We were engaged by the Eagles in 2014 to just listen to what their needs were and pitch a system. They actually didn't call us and say, we want this particular system. They said, tell us what will fit for us. And they described a MAM as best they could, but they were actually describing an automation platform almost every time we talked to them. They would talk about search, and they would talk about content reuse based on search results, and certainly a MAM brings that to them. But then they would talk about all the business process they wanted to make more efficient, and all the ways that they could automate things without really realizing they weren't talking about a MAM anymore. Additionally, I love this point, every discussion that we had with them ended in multiple I want a pony scenarios. So we joke, we had an engineer, Terry, on the team in like 7 or 8 years ago. He was in a customer meeting, and they kept throwing all these crazy ideas at him, and he finally got up on the board, and he wrote out 3 columns. And the first one was need to have, and the next one was nice to have, and the last one was I want an expletive pony. And he said, guys, we got to get this in order. And so we've kind of used that term for a while now. And the point here is not that they had ideas that we couldn't accomplish that were just too far-fetched. It was too much for one project. So a kickoff project has to have phases. And phase 1 had to be done in an off-season. And they had ideas that could take 2-3 years to accomplish all of them if we worked straight through it. And so we had to categorize, what are these things that are just, they're too far out, they're not priority today, and by the time we get to them, the technology might be different. And we kind of called those the I want a pony scenarios. They had a lot of entrepreneurial ideas. Their executive producer was very passionate about getting content out to the community in different ways, and he was very different in the NFL. He sold us on a lot of those ideas. He sold, his marketing, department and his executives on these ideas. And we need to be able to react to those very quickly, because if you don't, you squash those ideas, and an entrepreneur doesn't really, cater to that very well. Lastly, some quick points. The systems and the users would be moving around physically. I'll get more into detail on how that affected us soon. And then IT required high security. To them, that meant no cloud. So 4.5 years ago, while cloud seemed like a decent option, but it wasn't exactly ready for us like it is today, we had to do what we would want to do today in the cloud on-prem because they felt it was more secure. And for various reasons at the time it was. But it still had to be simple for them to support. And what we really mean by that is we needed to be able to support it, but they needed to be able to be confident in what we were supporting and what that approach was, and they wanted to be able to be a tier 1 to us as we supported that system. And these were, a couple IT guys that were stretched very thin, who worried more about security than they did about process and workflow. And so it was a big sticking point for us that we had to be really careful of. So we defined a handful of requirements on day 1 that we felt would be important for us to meet in order to achieve the workflows that they wanted for years. And those, a couple of those points up here: quick implementation, new capabilities during a short off-season. The off-season's 4 months, but it's not. It's about 2 months, and they're on vacation whenever you need them during that 2 months. So it's really hard to accomplish any integration during a NFL off-season. Additionally, we needed to know that we could just use any language, any integration point, and so XML, JSON, REST, SOAP, hot folders, FTP, you name it. We need to have that option because we had no idea what these products that we'd be integrating with would be in a year or 2 or 3. We needed single pane of glass workflow status reporting. We needed it to be easy for a non-technical user to see the status of a workflow and to be able to call us and get support and be able to explain what they saw, or for IT to help them when IT doesn't actually know how these systems work either, in their own facility. So we landed on, knowing that we needed an ESB. We needed an on-premises enterprise service bus capable product that could grow not just horizontally but vertically. So horizontally, if we had an integration platform in the cloud, we'd be able to go horizontal and do hundreds and hundreds of integrations with common integration types. But we need to go vertical. We didn't know what we were up against in the future. And lastly, we need to be able to extend into the cloud because most integration points were cloud-based even though we weren't in the cloud. So a quick overview of the infrastructure, very quickly. This is what kind of generic slide of what their infrastructure looks like. We have a store next SAN that replicates from NovaCare Center to Lincoln Financial Field. We then have, everything's fiber channel storage based. The servers for Reach Engine, that integration platform that we're using in the MAM, as well as their transcode server, their SAN clients are all on the fiber channel on that fabric directly. So they all have the highest bandwidth possible. Because in an on-prem scenario supporting editors working off the storage, we needed that. Additionally, we have a replica over at Lincoln Financial Field with an archive in that location and a dev environment. That dev environment is crucial in this type of environment where we're doing automation platforms and constant integrations. Can easily put an integration in place in a new workflow, and it could take the system down because of resource allocation and queuing that you need to tweak, and you need to know that you had a location or a separate system that you could run those development efforts on and then migrate over to production later on. So one point on this slide, I talked very quickly earlier about the need to handle everyone moving around physically. When we started this project, and this also gets into the needing a system that was very agile for us. When we started this project, the guarantee that we were given was all users would work out of NovaCare Center, which is about 2 miles down the road from the stadium, and that's their headquarters. And halfway through the installation, which was already short, we were given a late approval a month before the first preseason game. We had to be live by preseason, and we had to transition them all from other systems onto this one. And it was already something we couldn't attain, properly. We knew we were going to be passing that deadline. Everyone was okay with that. They came to us and they said, "We're not moving those users. We don't have the time." And so, we had a little scope creep, as happens, and we had to get creative. And they said, "Just extend the SAN to the other side." And I reminded them that this dotted line is 2 miles of road, and there's two 10-gig links between the sites, and you can't just extend the SAN down the street. And so what we did was we were able to quickly redevelop our workflows and take all the ingest workflows for this client and have them write to both volumes at the same time with the same names. And so someone sitting over at Lincoln Financial Field who was editing thought they were on their SAN that was over at NovaCare Center. Even IT forgot that it was one SAN with a replica, and we had to remind them every now and then that they were actually being replicated constantly by workflow, driven by the users doing work in one location and being pushed to the other. And then we had to reverse that, which was very interesting, but with a system that was really agile for us, with that plan in place of everything we knew we needed to cover, not knowing what the future would bring, we were very quickly able to handle that. So the growth and evolution of the integrations themselves. We've done over 150 custom integrations for the client over 4 years, and I want to show you a little bit of what that looks like. So this is a snapshot of some of those workflows. Now, of that 150, some are sub-workflows of master workflows. So this list is a pretty thorough list of the main workflows that we had put in place. But to highlight a couple that are italicized up here, first, ingest historical content. That was an easy one. They had everything organized in nice folder structures. We just spit into the system. Nothing really big to do there, but it got content into the system to help them adopt it in change management. But then ingesting game day content was another loop we were thrown. They said, "Can you just go ahead and just ingest directly from our dream catchers? It should be easy, right?" And we said, "Well, what are we talking about here? Let's go and talk to the integrators on that side and figure out what we can work with." And we luckily had that second system over at Lincoln Financial Field that we could tap into and have the dream catchers write directly to it and replicate that all back between the locations. And the goal there was, and just this was kind of the I want a pony moments, but we met it because we thought it was really cool also. We were asked to get access to content during game day within 3 to 5 minutes of a play happening. And we said, "Well, how do you do it now?" And they said, "We have camera runners and we have people on the sideline with P2 cameras. And about an hour or two after a play, we'll get that camera card ingested. And then an hour later, it'll be sent over to NovaCare where all the editors are sitting." So we had to go from 1 to 2 hours to 3 to 5 minutes. And we actually got down to 1 to 3 minutes with the integration. And it was simple hot folder integrations, honestly, with the dream catcher dropping to a hot folder and then syncs between the locations and the integration platform coordinating all of those syncs and transcodes and proxy creation between those sites. So a couple other points. One that I really like here, I actually forgot to italicize it, deliver it to flyeaglesfly.com via API. So in their second season with us, they came to us with one of those grand entrepreneurial ideas, and they said, "We don't like our NFL website. We want to do our own for the community, and we want our own YouTube-like platform. And we think this is we're going to show the NFL how we can really do this and how the site could be better." And there was a little bit of politics involved, but they pushed it forward, and they were able to put in Kaltura at the time, and on the fly, we wrote a lot of workflows in the first quarter of that season. And by third quarter of that season, those workflows were all turned off, and the NFL had turned that website off. But those were the kind of ideas that were coming up that we had to accommodate so that the entrepreneurial nature of their executive producer, that his needs were met, because it was his creative juices flowing. We needed to support that. So the next one I want to highlight here before I move on is Photo Shelter. So Photo Shelter is a product that's cloud-based and has very, very thorough, very rich APIs that we were able to work with. The photographers are on the sideline, and they FTP their content right from their still camera up to, during the game, up to Photo Shelter, which is a secure FTP. It's like a virtual FTP that they use. Once the file is up there, it gets moved off, and it gets moved into a new location, so the FTP site always looks empty, so it's more secure. Once that content's up there, we could poll with an integration platform and see what that listed content looks like and pull it down immediately. So we were, again, going from, say, 1 hour of waiting for photos to show up to the users down to a couple minutes. And I'm going to use some examples of that workflow in a minute here. So we had to choose a platform that really supported our plan. We didn't want that first slide. We didn't want the traditional accidental architecture. We didn't want to build an architecture over time. We wanted to have that plan up front and build on a common plan going forward. So some quick examples. There's some XML on these next slides. They're not very big, so I'll walk you guys through it very quickly. So in this integration platform, we have a language that we're using. It's just Spring XML, and that is the instruction set for the integration platform. That instruction set tells it what steps to run and what order to run them and the branching of those workflows and decision-making in those workflows. Online, there's a live XSD that we can poll while we're writing workflow, and while we're coding that workflow, it will actually validate it on the fly. So it makes our work much more efficient. And we know that we're writing in a way that's compatible with the latest version, latest SDKs of the platform itself. We can leverage Java functions right inside that workflow. We can create case statements or like if-then statements and do branching in the workflow. I'll show you an example of that. And we can control workflow step progress, labels, and errors. So for me, this comes down to support again. Is when we have a customer who's not technical with seasonal interns who have no idea what they're doing, and they're going to call into support and they're going to ask for help, we need to be able to control what they're seeing and what they're telling us they're seeing so that we know exactly how to help them as quickly as possible. So the last thing they want is a question back for clarity during game day. So having real agility through integration, some examples here of what we can do in this platform. First, just a simple API call. Instead of having to go in and do an API call in Python or Ruby or Perl or fight over what language we use, we were able to just do a step inside the XML and call on a Java function and do an HTTP step. And so what we have up here as an example, the first chunk of this XML, the first step is a subflow that calls another workflow to get an authorization key from the cloud product, from Photo Shelter. Once it gets that authorization key, it then passes that back as a variable to the initial workflow and goes on to a second step, which is the API call to get a list of all of the new photos over time. So that list of photos comes back as a JSON file. That JSON is then parsed in the next step. It's passed as another variable that's cached as a payload into the next step, which is a context data step. So we get contextual data from that JSON. We figure out all those new images, and then we were able to run a sub-workflow after this that you can't see that ingests all those images from the cloud system. A very nice feature of this is we could actually take all of the unique keys for the customer, that is their credentials to their cloud products, and we're able to store them in a separate secure file, which makes these XMLs transportable. We could use these between clients. We could use these. We could store these in a less secure system because there's no, well, there's some IP in them. There's no credentials in them. And so there's system calls right in the middle here, sysconfig calls that call on the API keys that are unique to that customer. So one of the things that we struggled with for years in MAM integrations and automation platforms was we were doing a lot of middleware, and we would fight over what language we would use. We had one guy that did everything in Bash, and he just was adamant, you can do it in Bash. And we had another person that liked Python and learned Python one weekend just to prove a point to the other guy that that was the way he should go. And he won, he was right, but we don't need the arguments, right? So everyone gets passionate about these languages. I did a workflow with the developer for this before, and they sent me a Perl script, and then the next day they sent me a Ruby version of it. I'm like, I don't know how to work with this, guys. This isn't what I do. So having that Spring XML and the platform allows us a certain level of standardization, but then we know we still need to extend more than what that capability is with the workflow itself, with that workflow engine. So we do that in Groovy, and that's a common scenario for something that's Java-based. Groovy is a Java language that we're able to tap into and do more with a Groovy script than we can do natively with a workflow step if we ever need to extend past that. So we get rid of those age-old battles over scripting methods. And then, I'm a real process-oriented person. I really see the value in defining really clear process and rules around the way you move forward, the way you plan, the way you integrate. But one of the reasons I really like to do that is because then you have a reason to break those rules, and you know when you're doing it. So you do that purposefully. You always have to break rules at times. There's always gray area. There's always a reason process doesn't work. But by defining that process, you're able to know when that process doesn't fit. And so that's my last point here, is the team that supports this and that integrates these products can agree on when they actually go outside the box, outside that plan, and they use a different language. Sometimes they will write a Python script. Sometimes they will write a Bash script. And they'll do it because they know they need to, because the process and the plan we had in place didn't fit. And they try to validate it. It didn't work, so they agree on moving forward. They don't argue over languages anymore. So another example here of what we can do with the system is branching, which I spoke about briefly earlier, branching inside the workflow from one workflow and going into subflows based on the analysis of data and intelligence. So this example is actually from an ingest workflow. What's happening here is during an ingest workflow, the client had around early 2016, they came to us and they said, we don't like that when we're in our nonlinear editor and we zoom in on a timeline, we see the camera card's file name, we don't see the metadata of the asset. And the nonlinear editor they're using wasn't able to show any metadata from the asset outside of the panel they were using for their MAM. They wanted to see it in the bin, they wanted to see it on the timeline. So the way to achieve that was to rename the file. Other than that, if we didn't do that, we would actually be stamping XMP, but then that XMP can get old, and you get into some struggles there over time, especially when you have archive systems involved. So we made the decision to actually rename the files based on static metadata that we knew would never change on an asset when it was ingested. So what's being shown here in XML is we gather metadata from the user on ingest, and then we analyze every single asset, and we look in this first transition, what is the category? And if the category here of that asset, told it to us by the user when they logged it, was historical, community, corporate, football analysis, and there's a handful more that go off the screen, then that's an event. And we have an event-based metadata scheme that dictates the naming convention we would use on that file. And so we would then go to the next step where we would generate that file name and then move on to do the final ingest and rename the file. If that is not true, it just moves on to the next transition. That next transition says, if it wasn't any of those, is it game day? Is this game day content? If it was, then it goes to that next step and it renames the file based on the metadata scheme for game day. But if it wasn't, it moves on again, and it says, well, none of these were true, so we have a step called invalid categories. And a step not shown here is a graceful failure step. Is the user ran a workflow, but then put in information that didn't match what the workflow needs to do. And so we can gracefully fail that and control the language that they see when it fails. And we can say, very honestly and transparently in the system and in human language, you tried to ingest files that don't match this workflow. And then we can analyze that over time, and we can start changing the workflows and not even allow them to see the workflow to run it as we see what errors they run into. So our next example here is workflow queuing. This is crucial when you're doing a platform that's central to all workflows and in an integration platform. Is you're going to tax the system, you're going to tax the network, you're going to tax the system resources, and at times you're going to tax the integration endpoints themselves. So in this example, we had a quick integration that was actually FTP based to start, just to get it going with Media Silo. And their goal, they basically gave us a day to figure this one out. So again, Agile system allowed us to react very quickly. They said, we have a new partner that came on, new broadcast partner, and we're syncing everything between all of our broadcast partners with Dropbox, and they won't accept that. And we said, good for them. So what can we do differently? So we actually threw in Media Silo very quickly. We were able to FTP up to it, but it has a limit of 5 connections, or at least it did at the time. If you got to a 6th connection at once, all the other 5 failed. It didn't just finish the 5 and fail the 6. It would actually fail all of them. So we had to put a limit on 5 so that we never hit number 6 and killed them all. In addition to that, IT freaked out about uploads and large files, and we're talking about 60, 70 gig files at times going to these broadcast partners. And so the limit of 5 actually helped the network bandwidth as well and appeased the IT folks. So the end user experience going through this, first, a screenshot of what it looks like for a user when they're looking at a specific asset. They can play the asset, they can see the metadata, they can do search at the top bar there, fairly standard MAM interface. But the workflow list that's dropped down the middle, coming from this ellipsis up on the top, that workflow list is catered to just what we want that user to see based on the media they're looking at, the content type, the asset type, what their role is, and what their permissions are. So they're only going to see a workflow that they're allowed to run against that content that could be successful. They're not seeing options that don't match all of that criteria, so it keeps them more focused. Here's an example, and this is a little bit hard to see. There was another screenshot we could show of this in a Prelude panel or Premiere panel as well, but I chose this one because it's a little bit more thorough. So we like to take as many processes as we can, as many business processes, and combine them into one workflow UI so the user's doing as little mundane work as possible. One of the things that we ran into, a year into this install and this support was we found out that an intern at night would be given a final sequence to render out to get to air the next morning. And they would render that out for the editors after they left, and then they would ingest it into the system. And then once the ingest was finished, they would then go find it in the system, which was very quick, and then they would run a workflow to send it to YouTube, and another one to send it to Facebook, another one to send it to a broadcast partner. And we said, just over time and seeing the workflow statuses and what they were doing, we realized this can be a lot more efficient. And so we just made one workflow that branched into all the others, and we just have some decision making here. And so this very simply is, what metadata do you want on the file so we can run an ingest against it and categorize it properly, rename it if we have to based on that last example. And then all these radio buttons are where do you want to deliver it to? And so we'll just do all of this for you. At the end, there's actually more options. Do you want it archived to tape at the end? So we combine all these processes, and by running one workflow, that intern is now able to leave like 2 hours earlier at the end of the night. And the people supporting them, ourselves as well as one librarian, were able to not worry about supporting those couple users sitting there for hours at night, just waiting for a workflow to finish to run the next one. So by analyzing the input that they would give us, we would branch the workflows and combine all those workflows on the fly and allow them to be more efficient and have less decision making for a free intern who can't really make all those decisions anyway. So this is what it looks like to support from the user's perspective and the admin's perspective on site, is when something's successful, it's green. And when you go in every step in that XML workflow, every node, if you were to have a node-based connection diagram of these workflows, is represented in steps throughout this chain of the workflow. And you see all of those green, you're happy, everything finished at 100%. If one fails, then simply it turns red. You have a little play marker so you can replay it. Or you can retry that workflow, and if it does fail, the step that it failed on, the exact step and place in that workflow that it failed on is what's highlighted. And then when they call or email or send a ticket into support, they can just say, hey, this step that says create proxy failed on this workflow, can you take a look at it? And we know exactly where to go. We can very quickly support that. So there was a little debate yesterday, and I added some slides this morning to address our thoughts on this. Yesterday was about documentation. How do you document to support well a very IT-centric system where you don't just have lines going between pieces of equipment, and you actually now have lines needing to go between services that are on multiple servers, and there's redundancy to them and failover to them. And now this is a different scenario. This is an automation platform. Yesterday was a different topic, but these are all IT systems. So what we do is, I say it takes a village. There's an ecosystem of documentation that's required to really support this properly. And to do this right, you need to start that documentation before you start writing any integrations. And then you need to go and update that documentation when you're finished. So IP sheets, obvious, shared password vaults, if you don't have AD integration across everything. We highly recommend AD across every piece of the workflow for anything anyone's authenticating to. Then we have connectivity diagrams that are more traditional, and then traffic and service maps workflow swim lanes. Monitoring services is a big one. The monitoring platform itself that you would integrate and use is actually, in a way, part of your documentation. It helps to really tie everything together in many ways. Storing statistics in that system so that you have another system to look for where something might have failed, why it might have failed. And then lastly, and this is a little self-serving in terms of what we feel is really successful as an integrator and a partner, is that relationship with the integrator and partner is crucial for this support. The reason I say that is, a vendor is very good at supporting their product, and they're usually extremely well at supporting their integrations that they wrote. But if you're going to do anything custom, then you really need to have your documentation for one product really relate to the documentation for the next product. And if the vendors are the ones all supporting their own products inside your whole environment, your whole ecosystem, that's not all going to relate very easily unless the client takes all that information and makes that all themselves. And then they're adding another layer of difficulty there in creating that documentation. So, an approach that we take, integrating a client who doesn't have all those technical resources, is we provide all that first-tier support so that we can do all that documentation and connect everything in that documentation and have that very thorough. So some quick examples, traffic map so that InfoSec can sign off on all of the ports that are used and why they're used, and then we also kind of dual purpose this and show all the services on every box. So this is just another piece of that ecosystem of documentation. There's the infrastructure diagram we showed earlier. This shows everything that's running on each one of those boxes. And this is kind of a stripped down example of this. This also is important for just your general network design. What VLANs are you running? What ports are you opening up? What firewall rules do you need? And then we get into monitoring, where we really want to have a monitoring system that is looking for watermarks and looking for thresholds and sending alerts based on what those thresholds are. Some simple things is storage is running out of free space. You're sending an alert for that. Those are fairly obvious. But number of errors on a fiber channel port in these kind of scenarios, or number of database connections. At times we'll have thousands of database connections in a matter of seconds if someone does a large ingest batch and there's a lot of metadata for all that ingest. We want to monitor all of those intricate pieces, and that's all part of this ecosystem of monitoring and documentation and support. And then for what we don't have watermarks for, we still want to gather, because if there's an issue and you can't pinpoint it right away, you want to have a system we can look for anomalies. And lastly, choose a monitoring system that includes BPM rule sets. So what I mean by that is, our goal, and I'll jump to the next slide to explain this a little bit better, our goal is to be able to walk through a system, and if we have an alert for a service that's down or degraded, or performance on a network port that's degraded, anything, we want to be able to call that client and say, this particular service is affecting these 3 workflows, and if your user goes and runs this workflow, it may fail or it may be degraded. We're working on it. And that's what the really good end user experience is. That gives them confidence in their system. If you don't do that, then when you have an integration platform in the middle, the downfall of that system is if anything fails, it's usually not the platform that failed, but the client thinks it is, because that's what they're using. And so they call and they say, this product's terrible, it failed on me again. It's like, well, actually your archive's down, or your network's down, we have to call IT. But they don't see it that way. And so we want to be as proactive as possible so they know what is successful in their environment and what's not. So I like to do swim lane diagrams. We have all of our engineers and our clients working with us on swim lanes of the actual workflows. So this kind of bridges the BPM side and the ESB side. We like to split things out into services, and we'll note in the swim, a lane for every service and what service that box runs on, and then every piece of that workflow and what's run on that service. So what does success look like? A lot of green workflow status indicators and Lombardi trophies. So this is their trophy case at the stadium, or at the NovaCare Center right now. It's got a nice Lombardi trophy, NFC Championship trophies as well. So what did the NFC Championship Game look like? So this system's really used mostly for home games. It's very lightweight for away games, which is kind of another phase that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But for a home game, a peak that we have was about 10,000 workflows during the NFC Championship Game week. That included 1,500 during the game itself, 7,500 new assets that week, which was mostly game footage, but also some community footage and crowd shots of, outside of the stadium and such. 90% of all workflows were ingest workflows, and 50% of those were fully automated, so no user interaction. 50% of those, ingest workflows were content coming in from Dreamcatcher through an automation, or Photo Shelter from the photographer through an automation, or Media Shuttle from someone else that was doing a shoot, and all of that gathering metadata and putting that in the system to make it as efficient as possible. One note here is all of these are master workflow numbers. Every workflow branches into multiple workflows. So if you really get down to the numbers, it's anywhere from 30 to 50,000 workflows in a week. And for a sports team, that's a lot of workflows. And 7,500 assets during a week for a sports team is a lot of new assets. So this system was really stretched for that last home game that they played. And we had the luxury of being able to observe that at the stadium. And see how that interacted, and luckily we had no issues and we were just enjoy the game. This last point I think is really important. So 865 photos were checked out using custom checkout workflows, modified and checked back into the system, and then distributed out to social media and apps during the game. So 865 times, a group of 5 to 6 designers, I'd say 5 at any given point in time working together, were checking out these files, making new renditions, checking them back in as a new file into the system, and then running another follow-up workflow to distribute them out. Those photos all originated from the photographer on the field during that game. So in the span of a 4-hour, 4.5-hour game roughly, you've got 865 photos plus that were delivered into the system. Of that total, that 865 were checked out and back in, modified. If you really do the math on that, you're at over 130 per designer. And you're looking at about 1 photo per person at about 1.5 to 2 minutes. And that's incredibly efficient. And the only way to do that is from the most efficient systems to support them in a lot of planning. So this is what it looked like on the field at the end of the championship, the NFC Championship Game. We were not invited to the Super Bowl, unfortunately. And I wanted to throw this in there to rub it in for Rob, who probably would have loved to be at the game. So what does 2018 and beyond look like? So perpetual modernization, and if they're lucky, more Lombardi trophies. So what I mean by that perpetual modernization, as I said at the beginning of this, we wanted a system that was almost as cloud-like as possible, that could scale, that was very agile, but we didn't have the option of putting on cloud at the time for various reasons. But we needed to achieve what we would really want to achieve today in the cloud in that same way. One of the next things we're going to be doing, to kind of jump to the third point here, is we're potentially moving this whole application up to AWS. The reason for that is today this is a system that is used really only for home games. During away games, there are some editors that are sitting there waiting for content to come in. They get content from Media Shuttle. There are some nice integrations there, but it's not 10,000 workflows. It's not 7,500 assets. And so they would like their system to support them during an away game. And doing all of that to an on-prem system doesn't make a lot of sense to us. So we're looking at the best way to put the system into the cloud, but then still have on-prem storage supporting the editors and the needs there, and the integration with the control room systems where we're getting content to and from them as well. And so that will look like gateway servers that are kind of at the edges, and really the edge would be Lincoln Financial Field and NovaCare Center. And then when they're at an away game, they'll actually be in the same system and be able to ingest into it in a similar way with the same metadata, and not be sending over IP-based workflows with file acceleration, but really up to cloud and then back down, have a little bit more control. To jump back to the top, replacing Photo Shelter workflows with Libra. So it's another one of those scenarios where one integration point flies out and another one flies in. And we just need to always be agile with that, and we need to do those very quickly. And then onboarding additional user groups, which is going to extend the workflow needs. So thank you. We can take questions or jump to the panel.
While we get the panel up there, why don't we get everyone? And then I can roll it. Okay. So I'm going to bring the lights up.